have the full transcript. Let me write a completely new story applying the same formula. The morning I drove into that ditch on Route 9, I wasn't going fast. Maybe 30 miles an hour, maybe less. But the black ice didn't care how fast I was going. One second I was watching the tree line along the highway, thinking about nothing important. The next, the steering wheel pulled hard. Left and the world tilted sideways and my truck went down the embankment and into the ditch with a sound like the whole front end crumpling. Steam came up from the hood. My head hit the side window, not hard enough to knock me out, but hard enough that I sat there for a full minute just breathing, trying to remember where I was going and why. I was 68 years old, alone in a ditch on a back road in rural Ohio, and my phone showed no signal. Nobody drove past for 23 minutes. I know because I counted. The man who finally stopped was driving a county maintenance truck, orange and mud-spattered. He came down the embankment with a flashlight even though it was full daylight, the way people do when they're nervous. His name was Dale. He had a gray beard and wore the kind of insulated vest you buy at a farm supply store, and he looked at me the way you look at someone you're not sure is going to be okay. "You hurt?" he asked. "Just my pride," I told him. He drove me to the urgent care in Millbury and waited in the parking lot while they checked me over. Never asked if I needed anything. Just waited. 2 hours. I came out with a mild concussion diagnosis and a prescription for the headaches, and Dale drove me back to my truck, which by then had been pulled out by a tow company he'd called while I was getting examined. "Got someone who can come get you?" he asked. I almost said yes out of habit. Then I thought about who I would call, and the list was shorter than I wanted it to be. My daughter lived 40 minutes away. But we hadn't spoken in 3 weeks, and the last conversation had ended with her telling me I was impossible to help. My brother was in Arizona. My wife Ellen had been gone for 6 years now. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end of it. "I'll be fine," I told Dale. "I always figure it out." He looked at me for a moment like he wasn't sure he believed me, but he let it go. That was the day I should have understood that something had gone badly wrong in my life, not the accident. The list. The fact that when someone asked if I had anyone to call, I came up empty. I didn't understand it that day. It took another 4 months for the full picture to come clear. My name is Gerald Marsh. I worked 39 years as a civil engineer for the county of Lucas. Roads, bridges, drainage systems, the infrastructure that people use every day without thinking about it. I liked the work. I was good at it. When I retired at 64, my colleagues threw a small party in the conference room and gave me a framed photograph of a bridge I designed over the Maumee River. Ellen and I had planned to travel. We talked about New Mexico, about the coast of Maine, about renting a cabin somewhere in the Smoky Mountains for a whole month. We had a savings account set aside just for that. She was diagnosed 4 months after I retired. The savings account paid for treatments that didn't work. By the time she was gone, I was 66, alone in a 4-bedroom house in Sylvania Township with no real plans and a grief that didn't announce itself dramatically, but instead settled into everything like moisture into old wood, quiet and pervasive and damaging in ways I didn't notice right away. My daughter Claire stepped in. That's what I thought at the time. She stepped in. She lived close, in the same suburb, in a house she and her husband Marcus had bought 3 years earlier. Nice house, nice neighborhood. Marcus sold insurance. Claire had done some accounting work before the kids were born and had stayed home since. They weren't struggling, but I knew the mortgage was aggressive and the kids' school was private, and Marcus had mentioned refinancing twice in passing conversations. 3 weeks after Ellen's funeral, Claire sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me she was worried about me living alone. I understood that. I was a little worried about it myself. She suggested I think about selling the house and moving into something smaller, more manageable. She knew a realtor. She'd done some research. I wasn't ready, I told her. The house was where Ellen and I had lived for 22 years. I needed time. Claire nodded and said, of course, take all the time I needed, and the conversation moved on. What I didn't know was that she had already spoken to that realtor. What I didn't know was that Ellen's life insurance policy, a substantial one we'd taken out together 20 years earlier, listed beneficiaries as me and Claire jointly. Ellen had intended to update it before she got sick. She ran out of time. What I didn't know was that Claire had already spoken to an estate attorney about what rights she had as co-beneficiary and what mechanisms existed to accelerate the process of settling the estate. I didn't know any of this for 4 more months. The job came about because I needed something to do with my mornings. Retirement without Ellen was a different thing than retirement with her had been supposed to be. The house was quiet in a way that had weight. I started waking at 4:30 and lying there in the dark with nowhere to put my attention. And I found that the hours between 4:30 and 7 were the hardest ones. A neighbor mentioned the county parks department was looking for part-time help, trail maintenance, clearing brush, that kind of work. Physical, outdoors. I applied mostly to have a reason to get dressed. They put me on a Tuesday-Thursday morning schedule. I drove my truck out to the Secor Metro Park at 6:45, worked until 11, drove home. On good days the work calmed something in me. On bad days it just tired me out, which was also useful. That's where I met Frank Cocello. Frank drove the department's equipment's truck, hauling tools and materials out to wherever the crews were working. He was 63, thick through the chest, with a white mustache and the hands of someone who'd done physical work his whole life. He'd been with the Parks Department for 8 years after retiring from long-haul trucking. First morning I was out there, I was struggling with a chainsaw that wouldn't start. Frank watched me from about 20 feet away for a solid minute without offering to help, the way experienced people do when they're deciding whether you know what you're doing or not. Then he walked over, looked at the saw, reached down and flipped the choke lever I'd missed and handed it back. "Forgot to check that," he said, not unkindly. I started it on the first pull. From then on, Frank and I fell into the easy rhythm that sometimes develops between men of a certain age, who don't feel the need to fill silence with words. We'd work near each other, break the coffee from the thermos he always brought, say whatever needed saying, and let the rest go unspoken. He'd lost his wife Margaret 3 years earlier. Heart attack, sudden, no warning. He talked about her the way I talked about Ellen, with that particular mix of precision and incompleteness that means the grief is real. "She used to reorganize my toolboxes when she was bored," he said once. "Drove me crazy. Now I'd give anything to come home and find them messed with." I knew exactly what he meant. We started sharing a lunch break by the 2nd month. Nothing elaborate, sandwiches on a tailgate. Frank always brought more than he needed and always offered without making it seem my charity. I started bringing coffee. He told me about his daughters in Colorado and Kentucky, about his years on the road, about a summer he'd spent working in Alaska when he was 24 and thought he was indestructible. I told him about the Maumee River Bridge, about 39 years of coaxing infrastructure out of budgets and weather and politics, about the 4-bedroom house that felt like a waiting room now. "Family close?" he asked one morning. "My daughter," I said. "She's nearby." "That good?" I thought about it honestly. "Most days," I said. He nodded like that was a complete answer, which maybe it was. The first thing that didn't feel right was the document Claire brought in September. She came by on a Sunday afternoon, which wasn't unusual. She brought the grandkids sometimes or stopped in to check that I was eating properly, which was kind of her even when it felt slightly like being managed. That Sunday she was alone, and she had a manila folder, and her demeanor was the careful kind that people adopt when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd talked to me 3 weeks after Ellen's funeral. "Dad," she said, "I've been working with the estate attorney on getting things properly organized. There are a few things that need your signature. Just housekeeping, really. Updating beneficiary designations, formalizing the co-trustee arrangement, that kind of thing." She slid 3 pages across the table. I looked at them. The language was dense the way legal documents are. But I'd spent 4 decades reading contracts and municipal agreements, and I knew what I was looking at. What I was looking at was a document that would consolidate decision-making authority over Ellen's estate assets into a single managing trustee. Claire's name was on the line for managing trustee. Mine was on the line for consent. I didn't sign it that day. I told her I wanted to read it more carefully, which was the truth, and she said, of course, take your time, with that same careful composure, and gathered up the folder and left. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the legal dictionary I kept on the shelf from my county engineering days, and I read the document 3 times. On the 3rd reading, I understood what I was being asked to give up. I didn't say anything to Claire immediately. I needed time to understand what I was seeing, and I needed to talk to someone who wasn't connected to any of it. I told Frank the following Thursday, sitting on the tailgate with our coffee, more because I needed to say it out loud than because I expected any particular response. He listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the tree line. "You sign it?" he asked. "No." "Good." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You know what that document was?" I told him what I thought. He nodded slowly. "Sounds about right. Does she know you understood it?" I shook my head. Frank was quiet again for a moment. "Gerald," he said finally, "in my experience, when someone brings you paperwork they call housekeeping, at a time when they're already nervous about their finances, and the paperwork happens to move your money closer to their control, that's not housekeeping." "I know," I said. "You need a lawyer, your own, not hers. I know that too." He looked at me with the kind of direct steadiness that I'd come to understand was just how Frank was, not aggressive, not judgmental, just honest. "And you need to find out what else has already been signed," he said quietly, "because as she brought you that paper this September, the question I'd be asking is, what was she trying to do before September?" That question kept me awake that night. I found the answer 11 days later, and it was Frank who helped me find it. He knew a retired paralegal named Vivian who'd done work for a legal aid nonprofit in Toledo before she retired. Frank had met her through his wife Margaret, who'd volunteered at the same organization. Vivian wasn't practicing anymore, but she knew how to look at documents, and Frank called her on my behalf. She came to my house on a Thursday evening. A small, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who wore her reading glasses on a chain and sat up at my kitchen table with the precision of someone who'd spent decades reviewing paperwork that mattered. I gave her everything I had: Ellen's death certificate, the estate documents the attorney had provided, the policy information for the life insurance, the document Claire had brought me in September. Vivian read for an hour and a half without speaking. When she finished, she set down her glasses and looked at me. "Has anyone filed anything with the probate court regarding the insurance policy?" she asked. I didn't know. She called someone, spoke briefly in a low voice, and hung up. "Something's been filed," she said. "A petition." "About a month ago." "What kind of petition?" She looked at me carefully. "A petition to have the insurance proceeds dispersed directly to the surviving co-beneficiary on the grounds that the primary beneficiary is exhibiting signs of diminished capacity." The words took a moment to land. "They're saying I'm not competent to manage it," I said. "That's what they're saying." I sat with that for a moment. The steam rising from my coffee cup. The clock on the wall. The photograph of the Maumee River Bridge on the shelf where I'd put it when Ellen got sick. Because looking at things I'd built helped me remember I was still capable of building things. "Ellen left that money to both of us equally," I said. "Yes," said Vivian. "She did. And Claire filed a petition to take my share away. Based on an assessment," Vivian said carefully, "performed by a psychologist. A private one." I hadn't spoken to any psychologist. "I know," she said. "That's the problem." Frank's hands were tight on the steering wheel the next morning when I got into his truck. Not shaking, but tight. He'd called me the evening before after I told him what Vivian had found, and we'd talked for nearly an hour, and he'd said he needed to show me something. He didn't start the truck immediately. Just sat there staring at the windshield. "Gerald," he said. "Yesterday when I was leaving the park, I saw your daughter in the parking lot." "Claire doesn't come out here," I said. "She wasn't there to see you. She was part of the far end by the maintenance entrance, and she was talking to a man I didn't recognize. They were going over papers together." The kind of conversation where both people are looking over their shoulders. Frank pulled out his phone. He'd taken a photograph, distant and slightly blurred, but clear enough. Claire in her dark blue coat. A man in a suit with a briefcase. Documents spread across the hood of a car. Her attorney, I guessed. I don't know. But after they were done talking, the man went to his car, and Claire sat in hers for a while. And then she made a phone call that went on for about 15 minutes. Frank set the phone down. I went back and asked Roy if he'd seen anything. Roy is the Parks Department supervisor. Been there 12 years. And? Frank looked at me. Roy said a woman matching Claire's description had spoken to him 2 weeks ago. Told him she was your daughter. Asked questions about whether you'd been behaving unusually at work. Whether you'd shown signs of confusion or disorientation. Whether there had been any incidents. The morning was cold and bright outside the windshield. The kind of Ohio autumn day that looks warmer than it is. She's building a case, I said. Frank nodded. Against your competency. Using your workplace, your co-workers. If she can get enough people on record saying they've observed concerning behavior in you, the petition becomes much stronger. He started the truck. Here's the thing, he said. Roy told her you were one of the most capable, careful workers he had. Told her he had no concerns whatsoever. I exhaled slowly. But Gerald, Frank said, the fact that she's doing this means she's not going to stop with the document she brought you. She's going to keep building the case. And at some point, the court is going to have to hear it. I know, I said. So we need to move first. Carefully. Correctly. Because she's your daughter, and you're going to have to live with whatever happens on the other side of this. We drove to the park in silence. The trees along the road had gone to their full October color, orange and deep red, and the occasional bright yellow. Ellen had loved Ohio in October. She used to drive around in the evenings just to look at the trees. I thought about her believing Claire would take care of me. She'd said it once during her illness when she was thinking about what would come after. Claire will be there. She's always been so responsible. Ellen had trusted our daughter, and I had too. I just hadn't understood what kind of person our daughter had become in the years when neither of us was paying close enough attention. The attorney Frank helped me find was a woman named Patricia Holloway, who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. She had a small office in downtown Toledo, diplomas on the wall and case files everywhere, and she listened to everything I told her without expression, taking notes in a precise hand. When I finished, she set down her pen. The psychological assessment they filed was conducted without your knowledge or participation, she said. Yes, that's problematic for them, she said. A court-filed competency claim based on a third-party assessment that the subject never participated in is going to face significant challenges, especially from a subject who presents as clearly articulate and organized. She looked at me directly. Do you have documentation of what you described? The original estate documents, the policy, Ellen's beneficiary designations. I had everything. I'd kept everything in a fireproof lockbox Ellen had bought years ago for exactly this kind of purpose. I'd brought copies. She went through them carefully. When she reached the September document Claire had brought me, she stopped. You didn't sign this? No. Good, she said simply. Then she found the original beneficiary designation from Ellen's life insurance, signed and notarized. This is what controls, she said. This is what she was trying to get around. She closed the folder and looked at me. Gerald, she said, here's what I need you to understand. What your daughter has done is not a small thing. Filing a fraudulent competency petition, conducting a covert psychological assessment for purposes of financial gain. These are serious matters. They may constitute elder financial abuse under Ohio law. I understand, I said. The question is what outcome you want. I thought about Claire at 18, coming home from her first year of college and sitting at the kitchen table and telling Ellen and me about her professors, about her roommate, about all the things she was learning. Ellen had cried a little, quietly, because she was proud and because time moved fast. I thought about the grandchildren. I want what Ellen wanted. I said finally. I want what she intended for her money, which was that it would come to both of us equally and be managed responsibly, and I want my daughter to understand that what she was doing was wrong. Patricia Holloway nodded. And that's what we work toward, she said. The legal process took most of the winter. Patricia filed a response to the competency petition in October, attaching documentation from my county career, character letters from colleagues and supervisors, a formal cognitive assessment conducted by a certified neuropsychologist who spent 3 hours with me and found no meaningful impairment. She also filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit regarding the manner in which the private assessment had been obtained and used. Claire's attorney attempted to argue that my engagement of legal counsel was itself evidence of outside influence, that I was being manipulated by a third party. He did not name Frank specifically, but the implication was clear. Patricia dismantled that argument in the hearing with a precision that I found quietly satisfying. The probate court dismissed the competency petition in February. The judge's written ruling noted that the petition had been supported by evidence that was procedurally deficient and substantively insufficient. In April, the Ohio AG's office issued findings regarding Claire's conduct. The findings concluded that the petition had been filed with the intent to financially disadvantage the primary beneficiary, and that the psychological assessment had been obtained under false pretenses. They recommended civil remedies. Claire and Marcus sat with their own attorney for 3 weeks before agreeing to a settlement that restored the insurance proceeds to their intended distribution and included a formal acknowledgement of harm. I was not in the room when they signed it. I'd asked Patricia to handle that part. When she called to tell me it was done, I sat in my kitchen for a long time without doing anything. The house was quiet. The afternoon light came through the window Ellen had always liked, the one that faced the backyard maple. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired and sad and grateful in a way that was hard to separate from grief. Claire came to the house in May. I told her she could. She stood in the doorway looking at the kitchen, the way people look at places they grew up, like they're seeing something underneath the surface of what's actually there. She didn't make excuses. I'll give her that. I got scared, she said. After Mom died, and the finances were complicated and Marcus was stressed, I got scared and I made decisions I shouldn't have. I told myself I was protecting the family, but I wasn't. I was protecting myself. I listened. I'm sorry, Dad. I know that's not enough. I know it. It's not enough. I said, but it's a start. We sat at the kitchen table for an hour and talked, not about the legal matters, but about Ellen. About what it had been like when she was sick. About things that had gone unsaid in the years since. Claire cried twice. I didn't, but I came close. When she left, I walked her to her car. I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen, I told her. But I don't want to lose you the way I almost lost you. So we're going to have to find our way back slowly. You understand that? She nodded. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was finally seeing her clearly. Yes, she said, I understand. Frank retired from the Parks Department in June. His daughters in Colorado had been asking him to consider relocating, but he wasn't ready to leave Ohio. He'd bought a small house in rural Fulton County, 10 acres, a creek running through the back of the property. He called me on the first weekend of July. You should come see this place, he said. Bring a fishing rod. I drove out on a Saturday morning. The house was modest but solid, the kind of structure built to last. Frank had spent 2 weeks already doing repairs. His old trucking discipline applied to joinery and roofing instead of logistics. We fished the creek for 4 hours and caught nothing significant, which didn't matter. We made sandwiches on the tailgate of his truck because neither of us had thought to bring lawn chairs. The afternoon light moved across the field behind the house, and the whole thing felt unhurried in a way my life hadn't felt in years. You okay? Frank asked at one point, meaning everything, not just the afternoon. Getting there, I said, and meaning it. He nodded. Margaret used to say the measure of a year wasn't whether it was good or bad. She said the measure was whether you knew yourself better at the end of it than you did at the beginning. I thought about that. I know some things I didn't know before, I said. Then it wasn't a wasted year. We sat there until the light started to fail. Two men in their 60s watching the last of the sun on a piece of Ohio land that didn't belong to either of us but felt, in the way good places sometimes do, like exactly where we were supposed to be. Ellen had believed in people fundamentally. It was something I'd always admired about her and sometimes found naive. After everything, I wasn't ready to go back to that kind of open trust. I'd learned too much about what people were capable of, even people I'd raised and loved for decades. But I'd also learned something else, that the right person could show up at exactly the right moment, not because they had anything to gain, but because showing up was simply what they did. Frank had never asked me for anything, never positioned himself as my rescuer or my benefactor. He'd just been present, consistently and without ceremony, the way you are with someone who matters to you. That wasn't naive. That was just what was real. I drove home in the early evening with the windows down, the summer air coming through warm and smelling of cut grass and the particular greenness of Ohio in July. The Maumee River Bridge photograph was on my shelf at home. The house on Stratford Lane still had the kitchen window Ellen had loved. The insurance money, when it finally cleared, went into an account I hadn't touched yet. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it. Something that would have made Ellen glad, probably. Something that would last. I was 69 years old. I'd lost a wife and nearly lost a daughter and found a friend I hadn't expected. I didn't know what the next chapter looked like in any detail, but I knew I'd have someone to fish with on Saturday mornings, which turned out to be more than I'd had at the start of that year, and more than I'd known to ask for. That's not nothing. At 69, after everything, that's actually quite a lot. I've been thinking a lot lately about the moments when a life turns, not the big dramatic ones you see coming, the quiet ones. The Tuesday morning when you almost sign something without reading it carefully enough. The Thursday when a man you've known only a few months decides to tell you something uncomfortable because he thinks you should know. Those are the moments that actually matter. What happened to me wasn't unusual, and that's the part that still sits heavy. Claire didn't wake up one morning and decide to become someone who would file a fraudulent court petition against her own father. It happened gradually, in the way that most moral erosions happen. One small rationalization at a time, one fear leading to the next. One decision that felt manageable in the moment and then required another decision to cover it, and then another. By the time she walked into my kitchen with another folder, she had already talked herself into believing she was doing something reasonable. That's what fear does to people. It doesn't make them monsters overnight. It makes them strangers to themselves so slowly they don't notice the distance. I'm not saying that to excuse her. What she did was wrong, and the consequences were real, and I had to sit across from a judge and explain what my own daughter had tried to take from me. That is not a thing that leaves you easily. But I've lived long enough to understand that the people who harm us are usually not operating from pure malice. They're operating from panic or scarcity or the particular blindness that comes from wanting something badly enough to stop asking hard questions about how you're getting it. Understanding that doesn't fix anything. It just helps you carry it without becoming bitter, which matters more than people realize. Frank showed me something different. He was under no obligation to pay attention to what he saw in that parking lot. He could have told himself it wasn't his business, that he'd known me less than a year, that getting involved in a family matter was more trouble than it was worth. Most people would have, and I wouldn't have blamed him. But Frank had spent 63 years building the kind of character that doesn't negotiate with itself about whether to do the right thing. That's not something you develop in a crisis. That's something you build quietly, day after day, in all the small moments when nobody's watching and it would be easier to look away. What I learned from all of this is something I wish I could go back and tell myself at 40, at 30, at 20. Your character is not a thing you deploy when circumstances demand it. It's a thing you construct through every ordinary decision you make when nothing important seems to be at stake. The integrity you bring to small things is the only integrity you actually have. Everything else is performance. Read what you sign. Not because people are out to get you, but because clarity is a form of self-respect. Know what you own, what you're owed, and what you're giving away. Ellen taught me that by example for 32 years, and I still almost missed it when it mattered most. And the last thing, the one that still catches me off guard when I think about it, is this. The people who show up for you are not always the ones you expected. Sometimes they're a man you met in a park with a thermos of coffee and no particular agenda, who just decided you were worth paying attention to. That kind of loyalty is rare. When you find it, don't take it lightly. I'm 69 years old. I know myself better now than I did at the start of that year. That's not nothing.